friends, welcome to DotVVM Minutes. In this episode I will talk about the differences between value binding and resource binding, and I will show you how to achieve server rendering in DotVVM, which is very useful if you are building a public-facing web app. To demonstrate the scenarios for server rendering, I have created a very simple blog site written in .vvm. Basically, it has only 2 pages. There is a list of articles with some paging. You can see that the number of the current page is appended in the query string in the URL. And if you open an article, so there is a listing, or there is the text of the article itself. And that's it, nothing really special. But since blogging sites are public facing, so users typically don't need to sign in, and you want your blog to be discovered by Google and other search engines so they can index all the texts that are in the articles, the server rendering is very important in these scenarios. So let's look how you can build such sites in .vvm. So first, let me show you the code. So it's a very simple site. There are only 2 pages and 1 master page. I'm using Bootstrap, which is installed here. You can see all those CSS and JavaScript files. And how I added the Bootstrap, I've just did add and client-side library. And this is a very nice feature of Visual Studio. It allows you to look up for JavaScript libraries on CDN, on CDN.js or other provider, and you can just search for a library and just install it into www root. And there is the file called libman.json, which says which library in which version will be placed in which directory. So it will also work on the CI. You don't need to commit these libraries. You can just tell libman restore, and it will restore these packages. So this is nice. If you haven't seen this feature before, go check it out, because it can be quite useful if you are just want to get a few common scripts in your app. So I'm using Bootstrap. I have registered a resource for the Bootstrap. So in .vvm startup, I have configured the paths for the CSS and JavaScript file, and also the jQuery, because Bootstrap needs jQuery. And I'm just requesting Bootstrap on all pages, so that's why I placed this in the master page, and everywhere in my app I have the Bootstrap CSS classes, which is nice because this title is just Bootstrap Jumbotron. So if you want to create such section, it's a few lines of code with some CSS classes. The first thing that little triggers me is the footer, because here I just want to print out the current year. And if you try to do it using a value binding, it means that you will need the year property in the view model. And why it should be in the view model? It's always the same for all the users, and basically I'm not interacting with this property in any way. I just want to print it out in the page. So what should I do with that? There is most people use value binding because it's the most fundamental concept in .vvm. But there are other kinds of bindings. So the value binding is the most typical, because .vvm is using model view model approach. So you want to bind properties in the view model to a user interface. So anytime you use value binding, it ends up being rendered as a data bind attribute, which is consumed by Knockout.js library that .vvm is using internally. And this library does practically all the magic. It will load the value from the view model and pass it to the user interface. And if it's bound in some control like text box or something like that, and the user changes the value, it will be propagated back to the view model. So this two-way binding experience is done by Knockout.js using the data bind syntax. the good thing on value binding is that if the page is already loaded and user interacts with the page and not going to another page but just clicks on the page, then these values can be dynamically changed at any time. Yeah? So user can type something in the text box, and if you bind this value on other part of the page, yeah, if you bind to the same property, if the user types something, it will appear on the other place too. Yeah, so this is dynamic, it's translated to JavaScript to knockout, and it's meant to manipulate with the view model. And also in the value binding, you should always only use properties from your view model. You shouldn't use something that's not in the view model, because DotVVM wouldn't know how to translate it, because all the data needs to be part of the view model. But the current year is something a little bit different, because we don't need it in the view model. It's not the state of the application, it's just some ambient value that gets rendered and forgotten. The user won't do any interaction with this value. So that's why we have the resource binding, and it's basically a binding expression that is evaluated on the server. So it can use other things, not just the view model. It can, but you can use anything else. You can call static functions or access static properties like datetime.now or something like that. You can use it to get text from the resource files. That's why resource binding is named off, because originally this binding was intended to just get values from resx files to be able to localize the app. But since the resx file entries are just static properties, so we didn't want to restrict this binding only to resource files, so you can use resource binding to just work with any expression that can be evaluated on the server. Yeah? So what I can do here is I can just remove the year property, because I don't need it in my view model, and notice that all the view models of all pages, they inherit from this master page view model. So this property is everywhere on every page. Yeah, that's why you should try to minimize the things that are in the master page view model. Okay, so let's remove it. And here in the resource binding, I can say datetime.now.year. And it will work. This is not a part of the view model. If you would use value binding, then DotVVM would need to know how to translate datetime.now.year. And probably it doesn't know how to translate it, because if you want to use it in the knockout.js, DotVVM needs to take this expression and translate it to JavaScript. The translation mechanism in DotVVM is extensible, so you can write your custom translation for datetime.now.year or for any other function or any other code that you need to use in the value binding, but you will need to provide the exact same code in the JavaScript. So I would need to translate this to something like new date dot get full year or something like that. Yeah, so it's not that easy to use this in value bindings, because you need to register your own JavaScript translations. But if you are using resource binding, this will get evaluated on the server, and it's not going to view model. It doesn't touch knockout.js. It will just be rendered in the output. Now it just recompiles the entire page, and you can see the result is exactly the same. But if I look in the page source, you can see there is no knockout.js binding. There is just 2021. Yeah. If you use value binding, like here here I am, for example, I have the paging. So this is the route link that goes to the previous page, and I have the visible and value page index is greater than 0. And if you look in the output, this is the result. So DotVVM took the visible binding and translated it to JavaScript syntax. In knockout.js, you need to need to have these parentheses if you want to read an observable value from the view model. And yeah, so this is translated from C# to JavaScript. It's very straightforward translation, but still there is some magic happening. and this is the knockout binding handler visible, which will show or hide the element based on this logical condition. So by principle, knockout bindings work very similar to .vvm ones, so they are easy to translate, but it's just rendered here, and the element is here in the output HTML, so it's always present in the page, and then it's just hidden dynamically using CSS. It will just append display none to it. If you want to just print out some value, you can see it's done by data bind or by this knockout command. If you are just printing out values in the HTML, knockout can use these commands. Yeah, so that's the other way how you can do it. But this expression is exactly the same thing that you would put into data bind. Yeah, so this is done by value binding. So this you would see this if I kept the value binding here. You would see this. But since this is the resource binding, it's rendered directly in the HTML. So let's fix the pagers too, because here this is also static thing. If you are on the page and interact with the page, and there are not many ways how to interact with the page, so this cannot change. Yeah? If the previous page is not there, you need to go to the next page, but that's you will need to load another page, because I'm not doing postbacks. I'm just going to the same route, but I'm setting the page parameter in the query string to a different number. So basically I'm reloading the page. So this doesn't change while the page is loaded. So let's change it to resource. And this will be evaluated on the server. So to knockout, it will look like this. It will have the exact same behavior as if you just type false or true here. Yeah. So that's the same thing. So let's see how this changed. So before I reload the page, let me show how it looked until now. So you can see there is the data bind visible expression. And if I go back to the Visual Studio, save the page and reload the source of the page, now you can see that this data bind attribute is not here, and .vvm rendered, because the first is invisible, so .vvm just rendered display none. So the element is still in the page, but it's not visible. The previous button is not here. And but what's the point of having elements in the page that are hidden all the time, because there is no Knockout.js binding, so nobody, except of you if you go to the DevTools, but nobody else can just make this element to be visible. So why would we render it at all? So let's look at the visible. There is the point of visible property is to be able to hide or show any element in the page. If you just want to remove it from the page, you can do it, but there is a different property, and it's called IncludeInPage. And if you use IncludeInPage with the resource binding, the element won't be rendered at all. Yeah? So if I use IncludeInPage instead of visible, then you can see the button is not even rendered. So this is a little bit cleaner. You will be transmitting less data. So if there's any section in your page that you want to render or not render in some cases, you can use IncludeInPage. And if this is not changed while the page is loaded, you can use the resource binding. So this element won't be rendered at all. It will just be skipped. Yeah. So this is also very nice. A question you can think about the answer. What would happen if I say IncludeInPage but use value binding? So I will give you 10 seconds to find or think about the answer. Because this means that this expression can possibly be changed while the page is loaded. So we will have to render the element in some way, because in the future it might appear. Yeah, but still, if it's included in page, we should remove it. So let's see what knockout or DotVVM, what DotVVM renders. And you can see this KO if syntax, and this if expression is works differently than visible. Visible just applies to display none or display default or block or something like that. But if you are using this if binding, knockout will remove this contents from the DOM, from the document object model, from the tree of elements in the page. But it will keep it for later, because if this condition changes to true, knockout will have to return this HTML back. But if I use resource binding, it won't get rendered at all, which means that even if this condition changes later, there's no way how the page could add this element back. Yeah, so this is static. You cannot ever change it. You will have to make the user to reload the page in order to be able to display this section. So use this carefully. Once you remove such section in this way, there is no way how you can get it back even if this condition is changed. Yeah, that's how server rendering works. If you just render something directly in the HTML without knockout binding or something like that, it cannot be changed later unless you reload the page. And what about the list of articles? So that's the last thing we might want to work with. So now when I refresh the page, you can see that this list of articles will flicker a little bit. Yeah, it takes few milliseconds until Knockout.js library is loaded, until the view model is processed, and until Knockout will just take the view model and apply these changes to the page. So it takes a tiny second. Yeah, and that's of course a thing you probably want to get rid of. So what we can do with that? Well, the obvious idea would be to use resource binding as a data source of repeater. However, it doesn't work. It's not supported by the control. Repeater and grid view controls are working with the collections, but they cannot just use resource binding to populate the data sources. That's one of the features that we would like to introduce in the future versions of .vvm, but currently with .vvm 2.5 it's not supported. So that's not how you can do it, but still there is other way you can do it, and that's called the RenderSettings.Mode. And if you set this property to server, then the repeater will behave differently. Not all controls support this. Some controls will just do nothing in this case, but repeater has a special inner behavior when this is set. And notice that this property is inheriting, so I can set it directly on the repeater, or I can set it on this div, so the entire section would be server rendered, or I can set it in the master page, but don't do it because there are some things that will behave differently with server rendering. So I recommend to turn it on only on places where you actually need it. So for example, this repeater. Okay, before I will remove it for a couple of seconds and reload the page so we can look in the source code, and you can see that this list of articles is also done by Knockout, because I've been using value binding and I haven't saved the file with the RenderSettings.Mode equals server yet. So this is how it looks by default. So this is the div with the articles, and there is just one template with the one article, and Knockout will take all the items in this collection and it will just copy this template, so there is so many instances, so the number of instances is equal to number of items in the collection. Okay, so this is a problem for search engines. Not a big problem because most of the search engines can actually run JavaScript. So it will just load a page, wait until the JavaScripts are initialized and processed. So occasionally it will see the content, but of course it will make your site a little bit slower, and search engines prefer pages that are faster to load. So whatever we can do in order the page is loaded faster, it will definitely help us. So the server rendering is one of the things. And if some tiny part of the users are using some not so clever search engines that cannot evaluate JavaScript, so this page is practically invisible for the search engine, because the only text that the crawler can find on this page is the title, this label, and this year. But there is no entries about the articles. If you don't support JavaScript, that's all you would see. So this is really not great. So let's turn on the server rendering. So now I have saved the page, and let's try to reload it. And you can see that now repeaters rendered different output. Yeah, so you can see that you can see the texts of the articles. So the same text the user can see, they are already rendered here. Also, this control needs to render these knockout commands, because inside of this element, if there is some data bind expression, it will need to access the view model. Yeah, so if you put some button inside, it will still need the view model. Yeah, so that's what tells knockout, and what tells the inner elements what is their data context. Yeah, so this is very important. It has to be there, but search engines don't care about these commands much, and they will be able to read these texts because they are rendered in the page. Yeah, so that's how you turn on the server rendering. Also, you have to remember that if you turn on server rendering, it's not possible to add more elements in the repeater. So if you change the view model and append some items in the collection, this is already rendered, so the new items won't appear there. Also, if you change the text, the title of some existing articles when the page is loaded, also this is rendered, so it won't change. There is no data bind expression or anything. There is one thing you can do, but use it only in the special cases where you need server rendering and you need to modify this content at the same time without reloading the page. There is postback.update, which you can set to true, and if you set it to true, that it means that whenever you do a postback on the page, so whenever you click any button and use a command binding to call some method in the view model, this control will be re-rendered and the new HTML will be sent to the client. Yeah, so this is the only way how you can do this, but since the repeater is quite long, so it means that you will get a bunch of HTML on every postback, so it increases the size of data you need to transfer between the server and client. So that's why you should use this carefully, because if you have been using ASP.NET Web Forms, this is the same behavior like the ASP update panel. Yeah, this part of the page can be changed, so if there's any change, just re-render it and that's it. Yeah, so this is quite dangerous. You can use it in some special cases, but I think that in my real apps I haven't been using this very frequently. Yeah. So if you have repeater or grid view, you can set RenderSettings.Mode equals server, and it means that this control will take all the items from the collection and it will render the individual items. Also, there are some restrictions. If you decide to add some items in the articles collection, this will not be these changes will not be applied because the HTML is already rendered. Yeah, so use this carefully. I'm using this property mostly on a public-facing parts of the website, which typically don't need to be interactive. If I'm if I'm showing the users the list of blog posts, even if I add a new blog post, the users will probably reload the page. Yeah, so and I haven't seen the refresh buttons in the page in most blogging sites. They just don't care if the user comes next time, the article will be there. Okay, we have the second page in the application, and it's very straightforward, and you should be able to do it yourself because we have already covered all these topics. So once again, if you look at the source code, there is also just a knockout.js command that will say, okay, print out the article.title and print out the article HTML, and because it's HTML, we are not using text binding but HTML binding. Yeah. So if you want just to be printed out in the page, you can say resource, and also you can say resource, and that's it. Now we have the full text of the page. There is one tweak you can also do. If it's just a property that you are printing out in the page and not doing anything else with it, you can send bind direction none. So this won't be included in the view model that is sent to client, so you will be able to save some data. Yeah. So it should look the same once it's refreshed, but the page will be shorter because these values are not in the view model. Yeah, you can see that there is just the ID in the view model, and I think that I don't need the ID at all, so I can use also this. And if I do it, the view model of this page will be completely empty because it's rendered on the server. Yeah, so now the view model only contains the CSRF token, which is necessary, but that's it. Yeah, and everything is rendered on the server. So you can do this here on this page because these properties are just strings and some primitive values. You shouldn't set the bind direction here on the articles because repeater and grid view server rendering, they still need the collection of items. Because if you would use, for example, a button inside this template, the button will need the object that is part of the view model. So you shouldn't just remove the entire collection. What you theoretically can do is just to mark these properties of the article. You can mark them as bind direction none. Yeah? But the collection will still be in the page. There will be the same number of objects that should be rendered. So Knockout will not complain about this. But the collection itself must be there because the repeater or grid view controls wouldn't work without the collection. That's also one of the things we would like to address in the next versions, but right now it's how it works. But since most of the HTTP communication is using the compression anyway, so having duplicate content in the same page typically doesn't increase the size of the page twice, but it's less because of the compression. So I wouldn't worry about right now, and maybe I recommend just wait until we will address this issue in the team internally in some of the next versions of DotVVM. So to recap, there is the value binding, which is rendered as knockout data bind expression, which means that you have all the features you expect from model view model application. So once the page is loaded, you can still change the properties in the view models, and the user interface responds to that. and it works the way back also, because if you change anything in the UI using the value bind, and there is the value binding, it will make sure that this value is propagated to the view model. If you want to just render statically something in HTML, you can use resource binding. It's not meant only to get values from resx files, but you can call any C# expression in this binding. The expression will be evaluated on the server, so you can access static classes, static methods, anything. And there is also a third option. Some controls are supporting or have different behavior when the RenderSettings.Mode is set to server. So for example, if you use literal or you will use value binding to print out something in the page, these will also be rendered as directly in the HTML. And repeater and grid view controls, they have also special behavior. They will render all the rows, not only the template that is used in the client rendering mode. So these are two features you can use in public-facing web apps. There is more we have in .vvm. Recently, one of the team members has created a library which can convert your .vvm web page to AMP version. If you haven't heard about AMP, it's a technology that's participated on by a lot of companies, but the most dominant there is Google, and it allows you to preload the pages when you are searching for them. So if you type something into Google and the page has AMP version, it's already pre-cached, so if the user chooses the search result, the page will appear immediately. And AMP is similar to HTML. It has some more features than standard HTML, and some features of HTML are not supported, so it's not a subset or superset. There's a lot of in common, but still there are some differences in AMP, and it's optimized for fast loading of the pages, and also the layout of the page can be calculated very quickly. So for example, in every image element you need to tell the browser the ratio of the width and height of the image, so the page doesn't just jump or move while it's being loaded, because the layout can be calculated before all the images and all the elements or external resources are loaded. So it is quite interesting, and this AMP library, basically you can just install it in your project and say, okay, for these 3 pages, please make an AMP version. And if there is something that's not supported, you will get exceptions. There are some controls which you can say, okay, ignore this piece of HTML in this page. And it can also do some transforms, like to add some attributes, required attributes to images that are not required in HTML but are required in AMP. So I guess that we will have some episode about this .vvm AMP support in the future. So if you are interested, post it in the comments. So I hope that this tutorial was interesting and useful to you. Please give us feedback on our Gitter chat or here in the comments, and see you next time with .vvm Minutes.